Your headphones are lying to you right now. The digital music we consume daily isn't capturing the complete sonic picture, but rather a series of disconnected snapshots masquerading as continuous sound. Today, we're peeling back the curtain on the strange science of digital audio. I've set up demonstrations that will let you hear the surprising differences between true analog sound and its digital counterpart. What exactly are you missing in your everyday listening experience? How do these subtle differences affect your perception of music? By the end of this video, you might find yourself questioning everything you thought you knew about audio quality. The illusion in your headphones. What if I told you the music you're hearing right now isn't actually continuous sound, but a clever trick? The seamless audio flowing through your headphones is actually a sophisticated illusion, an approximation made of thousands of disconnected points strung together to mimic a continuous wave. And your brain is filling in the gaps. This might sound strange, but it's the uncomfortable truth at the heart of digital audio. The music stored on your phone, computer, or streaming service isn't a true representation of the original sound waves. Instead, it's a mathematical approximation that captures key points of data and reconstructs something that sounds similar to the original. Think about sound in the physical world for a moment. When a guitar string vibrates, it creates a continuous wave that travels through the air. There are no breaks or gaps in this wave. It's a smooth, uninterrupted physical phenomenon. If you could somehow freeze time and examine this sound wave, you'd see a perfect, unbroken curve moving through space. But digital audio can't work with continuous phenomena. Computers operate on discrete chunks of information, binary digits, or bits. To convert that perfect guitar note into something a computer can store and manipulate, the continuous wave must be broken down into individual measurements taken at specific moments in time. It's a bit like trying to draw a perfect circle using only straight lines. If you use enough short, straight segments, you can create something that looks like a circle from a distance. The more line segments you use, the closer it resembles a true circle. But no matter how many straight lines you use, it would never actually be a perfect circle, just a very close approximation. This metaphor perfectly illustrates what happens when we transform the continuous, organic nature of sound into the discrete mathematical world of digital data. When sound is converted from analog, continuous to digital, discrete, we take thousands of measurements per second, 44,100 times per second for CD quality audio. These measurements capture the amplitude or height of the sound wave at each specific moment, but crucially they miss everything that happens between those measurement points. If we were to put analog and digital waveforms side by side on the screen, the difference would be immediately visible. The analog wave would appear as a smooth, continuous curve, exactly like the physical sound wave it represents. The digital version would look like a series of connected dots or a step pattern, with each dot representing one of those 44,100 measurements taken each second. From a distance, they might look similar, but up close, the digital version reveals its fragmented nature. Have you ever noticed how a song can trigger an intense memory? Just yesterday, I was listening to a digital recording of a piano piece and suddenly felt transported back to my grandmother's living room where she played the same song on her old piano. My brain filled in not just the gaps in the digital audio, but also the scent of her perfume and the afternoon light through her windows, all from disconnected data points. This remarkable ability of our brains to create complete experiences from fragments is what makes digital audio work. What's fascinating is that most people have no idea this compromise is happening. We've traded the complete continuous nature of sound for the convenience of digital storage and transmission. And it's a remarkable trade. The ability to store thousands of songs on a device smaller than a credit card would have seemed like science fiction just a few decades ago. There are actually two major lies that digital audio tells your ears. The first involves how we capture sound in time, breaking continuous motion into those frozen snapshots. The second concerns how we measure the exact value at each snapshot. Both involve approximation and rounding, and both mean that digital audio is never a perfect reproduction of the original sound wave, but rather a sophisticated estimation. When you hear a piano note in the digital recording, you're not hearing the complete piano note as it existed in reality. You're hearing a series of measurements that, when played back quickly enough, sound convincingly like that piano. Note, the original wave contained infinite points of data, every possible position along its path. The digital version contains only the specific points we measured, with everything else discarded forever. This might sound alarming, but the engineers who developed digital audio were incredibly clever. They understood human hearing and recognized what aspects of sound we can and cannot perceive. The sampling rate of 44,100 times per second wasn't chosen randomly. It was specifically selected to capture frequencies up to about 20,000 hertz, which represents the upper limit of human hearing. To truly understand why this matters and what we might be missing, we need to look at how sound was captured before everything went digital. In the analog world, sound recording was a physical process rather than a mathematical one. When you record the vinyl or magnetic tape, you weren't converting sound into numbers. You were etching its actual pattern into a physical medium. This created a direct, unbroken connection between the original sound wave and the recorded version, a connection that's severed in the digital realm. What's remarkable is how successful digital audio has been despite these compromises. The vast majority of people listen exclusively to digital music and never feel like they're missing anything. But as we'll see when we examine analog recording methods, there might be subtle qualities that get lost in translation. Qualities that explain why some audiophiles insist that analog formats like vinyl records sound more alive than their digital counterparts. Let's turn back the clock and explore how sound was captured in the physical world before we started turning sound waves into numbers. The physical reality of analog. Did you know that vinyl records contain actual physical imprints of sound waves? When you look at a record under a microscope, those tiny grooves aren't just abstract patterns. They're the literal shape of the sound itself, frozen in time. This physical reality of analog recording creates a fundamentally different relationship with sound than what happens in the digital world. Analog recording methods capture sound in its natural continuous form through direct physical processes. When a musician plays a note in a recording studio with analog equipment, the sound waves travel through the air and cause a microphone diaphragm to vibrate. These vibrations generate an electrical signal that mirrors the exact pattern of the original sound wave. This electrical signal then directly creates physical changes in the recording medium, whether that's the groove of a vinyl record or the magnetic particles on a tape. The beauty of this process lies in its directness. There's no conversion or approximation. The physical medium contains a continuous analog of the original sound, a direct, unbroken connection between what was played and what was recorded. This sound wave exists as a single, uninterrupted entity with infinite resolution between any 2 points. When examining a vinyl record, the grooves carved into its surface serve as a fingerprint of sound, unique, personal, and impossible to replicate exactly. The depth and shape of these grooves correspond precisely to the original sound's amplitude and frequency. The left and right channels of stereo recordings are encoded on different sides of the same groove, with the needle reading both simultaneously as it travels through the spiral. Under a microscope, these grooves reveal a mesmerizing landscape of peaks and valleys. You can trace the dramatic mountains of bass notes and the delicate ripples of high frequencies. Heavy percussion creates deep canyons, while subtle harmonic overtones appear as gentle undulations. This topography of sound provides a visual record of every sonic moment, a landscape carved by music itself. This tangible connection to the original sound vanishes in digital formats, where sound becomes a series of numbers representing specific points rather than the complete wave. When a record plays, the needle traverses these microscopic valleys, physically vibrating in response to their contours. These vibrations generate an electrical signal that's amplified and sent to your speakers. This creates an unbroken chain from recording to playback. The sound wave causes physical changes in the recording medium, which causes physical movement in the playback equipment, which recreates the original sound wave in the air. Magnetic tape preserves this analog continuity through a different physical mechanism. Rather than grooves, tape uses tiny magnetic particles embedded in a plastic strip. During recording, the electrical signal from the microphone magnetizes these particles in patterns that precisely mirror the original sound wave. The strength and orientation of the magnetic field at any point directly represents the amplitude of the sound wave at that moment. During playback, these magnetic patterns induce an electrical current in the playback head, recreating the original signal. The continuous nature of the original sound remains intact throughout the process. Like vinyl's physical grooves, the magnetic patterns on tape maintain a complete representation of the original wave without breaking it into discrete measurements. A remarkable property of analog recording is its infinite detail between any 2 points on a waveform. Zooming in on a section of vinyl groove or magnetic tape would continuously reveal finer structure of the wave. There's theoretically no limit to the resolution, just as there's no limit to how finely you can divide a physical distance. The subtle nuances of a performance, a pianist's touch, or a violin's complex harmonics are preserved in their complete, continuous form. Analog recording has its limitations. Physical media introduce their own forms of distortion. Vinyl collects dust and develops scratches. Tape can stretch or develop oxide buildup. The electrical components add noise and have frequency limitations. Yet analog imperfections often add to recordings in ways many listeners find pleasing, contributing warmth or character rather than clinical distortion. This infinite resolution of analog recording contrasts sharply with digital audio's approach. Digital conversion faces a fundamental challenge, representing continuous waves using only discrete data points. This translation requires sampling, measuring the wave at specific moments, and quantization, converting those measurements into specific numeric values. Both processes involve approximation, resulting in information loss. The continuous wave becomes disconnected points, and infinite possible values are rounded to available numbers. This explains why vinyl records often sound warmer than digital streams. They contain the complete unbroken sound wave with all its subtle variations and complexity. Every microscopic nuance of the original performance remains preserved in the physical medium, creating a direct, tactile connection to the music's origin. When listening to vinyl, you experience a direct physical descendant of the original sound wave. The groove moving your needle today was literally shaped by sound waves that existed in the studio decades ago, an unbroken connection linking you to that original moment. Digital audio operates differently. Computers process discrete data chunks rather than continuous phenomena. Storing sound digitally requires taking snapshots of the wave, measuring its amplitude at intervals, and storing those measurements as numbers. This breaks continuous motion into frozen moments, like capturing a dancer's fluid movements with still photographs. No matter how many snapshots we take, what happens between them is lost. The sound's continuous reality becomes disconnected points, with everything in between discarded. This sampling process reveals both the brilliant compromises making digital music possible and the subtle qualities potentially lost along the way. This technical reality helps explain why some insist vinyl sounds better than digital formats, even when measurements suggest otherwise. There's a fundamental difference in how these formats represent sound. One preserves its continuous nature, the other approximates it through mathematical techniques. Sampling, freezing sound in time. Imagine trying to capture a moving car using only still photographs. You snap pictures rapidly, maybe 24 frames per second, and when you play them back in sequence, the illusion of movement appears. But between each frame, the car actually traveled to infinite positions that your camera never captured. This is essentially what digital audio does to sound. Sampling is the first major compromise in digital audio. The process involves taking measurements of a continuous sound wave at fixed, regular intervals. Think about clapping your hands once. That single clap creates a sound wave that smoothly rises from silence, reaches its peak, and then gradually fades away. A digital recording system captures this transition through thousands of individual snapshots of the wave's position at precise moments in time. CD quality audio has a sample rate of 44.1 kHz, meaning the recording system measures the position of the sound wave 44,100 times every second. That's incredibly fast. Faster than we can consciously perceive. Yet no matter how many samples we take, we're always missing information between those points. The continuous nature of the original sound is fundamentally altered. This resembles measuring ocean wave heights with readings taken once per second. Between measurements, the water rises higher or dips lower than what you recorded. Those intermediate positions vanish forever in the digital version. When you record digital audio, the microphone captures the complete continuous sound wave and converts it to a continuous electrical signal. This signal passes through an analog to digital converter, ADC, which measures the voltage at each precise sampling moment. Each measurement becomes a number representing the amplitude of the wave at that specific point. Visualize a smooth, continuous wave with equally spaced vertical lines passing through it. Each intersection becomes a sample, a number representing the wave's height at that moment. When these samples are stored, everything between the measurement points disappears. The original wave contained infinite detail. The digital version contains only these specific points. Engineers discovered a mathematical relationship between sampling frequency and the frequencies being captured. This relationship, defined by the Nyquist theorem, states that to reconstruct a signal, the sampling rate must be at least twice the highest frequency present. Human hearing ranges from about 20 Hz to around 20,000 Hz. Following the Nyquist theorem, we need a sampling rate of at least 40,000 Hz to capture the full range. CD quality audio uses 44,100 samples per second, providing a buffer above the theoretical minimum. What happens with insufficient samples? This creates aliasing, a form of digital distortion when the sampling rate falls below the Nyquist rate. Higher frequencies become incorrectly represented as lower frequencies, effectively folding them back into the audible range. Consider a spinning wheel filmed by a camera taking pictures too slowly. On playback, the wheel appears to spin backward, exactly what happens with audio aliasing. Frequencies too high for the sampling rate get misrepresented as entirely different frequencies. Digital distortion often sounds harsh and artificial because of aliasing. It creates tones absent from the original sound, producing an unpleasant listening experience. To prevent this, recording systems use anti-aliasing filters before sampling, removing frequencies above the Nyquist frequency. Are standard sample rates capturing everything we can hear? The answer is complex. While 44.1 kHz sampling theoretically captures frequencies up to 22.05 kHz, exceeding the commonly accepted range of human hearing, some argue we perceive sound beyond just frequency response. Some audio engineers suggest frequencies beyond 20 kHz might affect how we perceive sound, even if we can't hear them directly. Harmonics, transients, and spatial sound interactions might all be influenced by these ultrasonic frequencies. This remains contentious among audio professionals. What's certain is that sampling changes sound's nature. The continuous wave becomes a series of disconnected points. The information between samples, potentially infinite detail, is permanently lost. Digital reconstruction algorithms create a smooth curve passing through these points during playback, but this approximates the original wave. When a violin plays a sustained note, gradually increasing in volume, this change in reality is perfectly smooth. In a digital recording, this smooth change breaks into discrete steps. If volume changes rapidly, as with a drum hit's initial attack, some nuance might fall between sample points and disappear forever. This explains why some audiophiles claim digital audio sounds less alive than analog formats. The spaces between samples contain information permanently lost in conversion. Whether human ears perceive this difference depends on specific content, conversion quality, and listener sensitivity. Higher sample rates like 96 kHz or 192 kHz capture more points along the wave, potentially preserving more original detail, but sampling represents only half of digital audio's approximation of sound. Even with infinite samples, theoretically impossible, we face another fundamental challenge. Each measurement of the wave's position must convert to a specific numeric value that computers can store and process. This brings us to digital audio's second major compromise, quantization, the process of converting precise measurements into the limited set of values available in the digital realm. Quantization, the rounding error. What if you could only adjust your music volume in large jumps, never smoothly from level 3 to 4, but snapping instantly between them? The subtle crescendo of an orchestra would become a series of noticeable jumps rather than a fluid swell. This volume limitation essentially illustrates the second major compromise of digital audio, quantization. While sampling divides continuous sound into discrete moments in time, quantization constrains the possible values each sample can take. When a digital system measures the amplitude of a sound wave at each sample point, it can't record the exact value with infinite precision. Instead, it must assign that measurement to one of a fixed number of possible values. In the real world, a sound wave can have any amplitude within its range. There are infinite possible positions. But in the digital realm, we have to convert these infinite possibilities into a finite set of numeric values. This is where the concept of bit depth comes into play. Bit depth determines how many possible amplitude values are available for each sample. In CD quality audio, we use 16 bits per sample. This means each sample can be assigned one of 65,536 possible values, 2 to the power of 16. Compared to the infinite values possible in an analog signal, this creates a fundamental limitation. When we record a sound digitally, the exact amplitude at each sample point must be rounded to the nearest value available within our bit depth. This rounding process is quantization, and it introduces a form of distortion called quantization error or quantization noise. The visual analogy of a staircase versus a ramp helps explain this concept. Imagine a smooth diagonal ramp representing an analog signal gradually increasing in volume. Next to it stands a staircase with the same general trajectory. The digital version follows these distinct steps rather than the continuous slope of the original. The size of these steps is determined by bit depth. More bits mean smaller steps and thus a closer approximation of the original smooth signal. This quantization process affects every nuance of sound. When a guitar string vibrates and gradually fades out, the decay isn't a series of steps in the real world. It's a perfectly smooth reduction in amplitude. But in digital audio, that decay must follow the available quantization steps, potentially losing subtle nuances of how the string's vibration naturally dies away. The effects of quantization become most noticeable in quiet passages or during sound decay. When a note fades to silence, it eventually reaches a point where its amplitude falls between two quantization levels. The system must round up or down, creating a jump rather than a smooth transition. In very quiet passages, these quantization errors can be heard as background noise or distortion. This is why recording engineers are so concerned with proper gain staging. If a recording is too quiet, the sound will use fewer of the available quantization steps, effectively reducing the bit depth and making quantization errors more noticeable. The audible result is a type of distortion that manifests as subtle hiss or graininess, particularly evident during quiet passages. At lower bit depths, like 8-bit audio, with only 256 possible values, quantization noise becomes very obvious, creating that distinctive crunchy sound of vintage video games. Standard 16-bit audio pushes this noise floor down to about minus 96 dB, quiet enough to be inaudible in most listening environments. Moving to 24-bit audio, with approximately 16.7 million steps, drops the noise floor to around minus 144 dB, well below the threshold of human hearing. With 8-bit audio, a piano note might start clearly but develop noticeable graininess as it fades. At 16-bit, this stepping becomes subtle, typically inaudible except in very quiet passages. At 24-bit, the quantization noise essentially disappears below other forms of noise in the recording chain. This is why modern studios typically record at 24-bit, even though the final product might be delivered at 16-bit. The higher bit depth provides headroom and ensures that quantization noise remains inaudible even when multiple tracks are mixed or quiet passages amplified. Can people really hear the difference between different bit depths? In properly conducted blind tests, most listeners can reliably distinguish 8-bit from 16-bit audio. The difference between 16-bit and 24-bit is much more subtle and typically only perceptible in ideal listening conditions with high-quality equipment. Some audio engineers and listeners claim they can hear qualitative differences beyond just noise levels. They describe 24-bit audio as having more air, depth, or spaciousness. These subjective impressions might explain why some recordings have a distinct digital character, not necessarily worse than analog, but different in ways that stem from these tiny mathematical compromises. Essentially, quantization forces infinitely precise measurements into predetermined buckets, losing subtle details. It's like measuring each person's height, but only using 1-inch increments. Someone 5 feet 9.7 inches tall would be recorded as 5 feet 10 inches. This small rounding error, multiplied across thousands of sample points, creates a cumulative effect that subtly alters the character of sound. This is such a lie in digital audio, the pretense that these discrete step values represent the smooth, continuous changes in amplitude found in natural sound waves. Combined with the first live sampling, we have a system that approximates sound rather than capturing it in its natural state. These compromises might explain why some people insist analog formats sound more alive. Analog recording involves its own limitations, but it maintains the continuous nature of sound in both time and amplitude. The waveform on a vinyl record doesn't jump from one discrete value to another. It flows through all possible positions, just like the original sound wave. Whether these technical differences translate into meaningful perceptual differences takes us into the realm of psychoacoustics, how we actually perceive sound. The audiophile argument. Why would someone pay thousands of dollars for vinyl equipment when they could stream millions of songs for $10 a month? This question sits at the heart of a passionate debate in the audio world. To some, it sounds like asking why anyone would ride a horse when cars exist. But to dedicated audiophiles, the answer seems obvious because analog sounds more real. Walk into any serious audio enthusiast listening room, and you'll often find a carefully curated collection of vinyl records, a turntable that costs more than a decent used car, and a willingness to explain exactly why this matters. These listeners describe analog sound using words like warmth, presence, and life, qualities they insist digital formats simply can't reproduce. Vinyl just sounds more alive, they'll tell you. You can feel the musicians in the room. They talk about soundstage, the perceived physical space of the recording, and how analog formats create a three-dimensional experience that digital audio supposedly flattens. But on the other side stand the skeptics, audio engineers, scientists, and listeners who rely on empirical evidence rather than subjective experience. They point to controlled blind listening tests and technical measurements, suggesting most people can't consistently tell the difference between high-quality digital and analog playback. These skeptics argue that preference for analog often stems from nostalgia, expectation bias, or simply the physical ritual of playing a record. This divide often feels less like a technical disagreement and more like two different worldviews colliding. Are audiophiles detecting something real that scientific measurements miss? Are they falling victim to an expensive placebo effect? The technical realities we've explored help explain the potential differences. Digital audio's twin compromises, sampling and quantization, mean that digital recordings are fundamentally different from analog ones. Analog formats preserve the continuous nature of sound waves, while digital formats approximate them through discrete measurements. But here's where things get interesting. Many audio engineers point out that analog recordings aren't perfect representations of sound either. Vinyl records introduce their own forms of distortion, surface noise, inner groove distortion as the needle approaches the center, and limitations in frequency response. Magnetic tape adds tape hiss, print through, and slight speed variations called wow and flutter. In fact, some argue that what audiophiles are responding to isn't analog's greater accuracy, but precisely these imperfections. The harmonic distortion introduced by analog equipment often happens in musically pleasing ways. When a vinyl record slightly compresses dynamic range or a tube amplifier, adds even order harmonics, the result can sound more pleasing to human ears in a technically more accurate reproduction. The goal is to enjoy the richness and beauty of music, whether spinning a vinyl record or streaming a digital file, notes one research paper on the subject. Ultimately, the best format is the one that brings the most enjoyment to the listener, regardless of its technical specifications. These analog imperfections might actually complement how we experience music emotionally. The slight compression vinyl naturally applies to loud passages can make music sound more coherent. The smooth, continuous nature of analog distortion often sounds more natural to our ears than the abrupt artifacts that can occur in digital systems. There's also the psychological dimension of how we experience music. Playing a vinyl record is a deliberate physical experience. You select an album, remove it from its sleeve, place it on the turntable, clean it, and lower the needle. This ritual creates focus and intention that's different from casually tapping a play button on your phone. The digital listening experience has steadily moved toward greater convenience, potentially less engagement. When music is always available, always perfect, and instantly skippable, does something change in how we connect with it? Many vinyl enthusiasts suggest that what they're seeking is a more intentional relationship with music. In controlled laboratory settings, researchers have tested whether people can actually hear the differences between formats. The results challenge many audiophile claims. Geringer and Dunnigan's 2000 study found that when listeners didn't know which format they were hearing, digital presentations were rated higher in quality than the analog presentations. Interestingly, this preference varied by genre. The difference was more pronounced for wind band and piano recordings than for choir and string orchestra examples. Yet blind tests have their own limitations. They typically focus on short segments rather than complete musical experiences, and they remove the visual and tactile elements that may be part of why people enjoy vinyl records. Digital audio also has technical advantages. As one research paper notes, digital audio is immune to physical degradation. A digital file will sound the same whether it's played once or 1,000 times, as long as it's stored properly. Vinyl records degrade slightly with each play, and even the best maintained collection will accumulate some surface noise over time. What does seem clear is that both formats involve trade-offs. Analog recordings are not without limitations. The process of recording, pressing, and playing back analog sound introduces imperfections, while digital audio offers precision and reliability that makes it the preferred choice for frequent travelers, tech enthusiasts, and those who prioritize convenience. So why do some audiophiles remain convinced analog sounds more alive, despite these technical limitations? Perhaps because the continuous nature of analog captures subtle variations that digital approximation might miss. Or perhaps it's because the specific limitations of analog happen to complement human hearing in pleasing ways. What's particularly fascinating is that many modern recordings try to have it both ways. Engineers often record digitally for precision, but master through analog equipment add warmth. Some will even deliberately introduce tape saturation or vinyl-like compression through software plugins, trying to recreate the pleasing aspects of analog limitations within the digital domain. This suggests that the future might not be about choosing between analog and digital, but finding ways to combine their strengths. But digital audio has another tool in its arsenal that makes its fundamental compromises less noticeable than you might think. A mathematical sleight of hand that allows those discrete samples to recreate continuous sound waves in ways that might surprise you. The mathematical magic trick. How can digital music sound so good when it's fundamentally incomplete? The answer lies in a fascinating bit of mathematical sleight of hand that happens every time you listen to a digital recording. This mathematical trick is so powerful, it allows digital systems to recreate sounds that, at least in theory, are indistinguishable from the original. This seems impossible at first glance. We've established that digital audio takes disconnected snapshots of sound and discards everything in between. It's like trying to describe a full movie using only a few still frames. How could you possibly reconstruct the smooth, continuous motion from just those isolated images? And yet, that's exactly what happens every time you listen to digital music. The surprising truth is that properly sampled digital audio can theoretically reproduce the entire frequency spectrum we can hear. As long as you sample at more than twice the highest frequency you want to capture, you can mathematically reconstruct the original continuous wave. When your digital music plays, the numbers stored in the file are sent to a digital to analog converter, DAC. This device exists in every piece of digital audio equipment, from smartphones to high-end stereo systems. The DAC's job is to take those discrete sample points and convert them back into a continuous electrical signal that your speakers can turn into sound waves. The DAC doesn't simply connect the dots with straight lines. This will create a jagged, stair-stepped waveform that would sound harsh and unnatural. Instead, it uses a sophisticated mathematical function called sync interpolation, pronounced sync. This process works like ripples joining in a pond. Each sample point creates its own ripple pattern that extends outward in both directions. These ripples have a specific mathematical shape, strongest at the sample point and gradually diminishing as they move away. When all these ripples combine, they interact in a precise way. Some cancel each other out while others reinforce, creating a perfectly smooth curve that passes exactly through each original sample point. I once watched audio engineer Susan Rogers demonstrate this process using a visualization tool. See these disconnected points? She pointed to dots on her screen. Now watch what happens when I engage the reconstruction algorithm. Before our eyes, the dots transform into a perfectly smooth sine wave. That's what's happening inside your music player right now. Mathematical magic. What's remarkable is that this mathematical reconstruction doesn't just approximate the original wave. In theory, it recreates the exact original wave. A violin string vibrating at 2000 Hz creates a smooth, continuous wave in the air. The digital recording system samples this wave tens of thousands of times per second, storing only those specific points. But when the DAC reconstructs a signal, it recreates a smooth 2000 Hz wave that mathematically matches the original at every point along the curve. The sync function at the heart of this process allows digital systems to perform this seemingly impossible feat. It's as if you could examine just a few frames from a movie and somehow calculate exactly what happened between those frames. However, there's a significant gap between mathematical theory and real-world implementation. Perfect reconstruction only works under ideal conditions that real systems can achieve. The sampling theorem assumes perfect anti-aliasing filters, zero time and jitter, and perfect reconstruction filters. Real DACs can't implement a perfect sync function that would require infinite processing power. Instead, they use approximations, employing reconstruction filters that introduce subtle errors into the rebuilt waveform. These filters have their own frequency responses, phase shifts, and potential artifacts. High-quality DACs use sophisticated designs to minimize these issues, but they can never be completely eliminated. Timing jitter poses another challenge. The perfect mathematical model assumes samples occur at precisely even intervals. In reality, tiny timing fluctuations occur due to imperfections in the digital clock driving the system. These small errors can introduce distortion absent from the original signal. Digital storage and transmission add further complications. Real-world digital audio often undergoes compression, introducing additional approximations beyond basic sampling and quantization. So while mathematics suggests that digital audio can theoretically match the original analog signal perfectly, practical implementation always falls short. The question becomes whether these deviations are significant enough for human perception. Some audiophiles claim they hear a difference, describing digital sound as having a hardness or a glare absent in analog formats. They might be detecting these subtle reconstruction errors, the ways real-world digital systems fall short of the mathematical ideal. Other listeners find these differences imperceptible, especially with high-quality equipment. The practical limitations may exist below our threshold of perception, masked by the natural imperfections of our listening environments and our own hearing. The mathematical foundation of digital audio makes it far more accurate than it might initially seem. The samples aren't isolated points. They contain information about the entire wave when processed correctly. But the theory only works perfectly in mathematics, not in the physical world of circuits, speakers, and human ears. This brings us to the heart of the analog versus digital debate. Can you actually hear these technical differences? Does the gap between mathematical perfection and practical implementation matter to your listening experience? The answer isn't technical. It's deeply personal and surprisingly complex. Can you really hear the difference? Have you ever wondered if you can truly tell your favorite record from a digital file just by listening? This question sits at the heart of the analog versus digital debate. For all the technical differences we've explored, the practical reality comes down to what our human ears can actually perceive. The scientific evidence paints a complicated picture of our auditory capabilities. Human hearing typically ranges from 20 Hz to 20 kHz, though this upper limit decreases with age. By our 30s, most of us struggle to hear anything above 16 kHz, and by 50, that ceiling might drop to 12 kHz or lower. This means many adults physically cannot hear the highest frequencies that high-resolution digital audio preserves. Hearing encompasses our ability to detect timing differences, dynamic contrast, and spatial cues that create a realistic sound image. Studies on our ability to detect digital artifacts have produced surprising results. When researchers conduct properly controlled blind tests where listeners don't know which format they're hearing, most people struggle to consistently identify analog versus digital playback. In one famous study, even experienced audio engineers could barely perform better than random chance when trying to distinguish between high-quality digital and analog recordings of the same source. But this scientific evidence exists alongside passionate testimonials from people who insist they can hear profound differences between formats. I can tell within seconds whether I'm listening to vinyl or digital, one vinyl collector told me. The digital version sounds flat and lifeless compared to the warmth and presence of analog. These listeners describe hearing greater depth, more natural timbre, and a more engaging emotional connection with analog formats. How do we reconcile these contradictory perspectives? Are audiophiles imagining these differences, or are scientific tests missing something important? The answer likely involves elements of both positions. Controlled studies have shown that when people know which format they're listening to, their preferences align with their expectations. But when the same people participate in blind tests, these strong preferences often disappear. I experienced this firsthand when I set up a listening session with friends who were convinced they could identify vinyl instantly. With the equipment hidden from view, their certainty vanished, and their guesses became no better than chance. This suggests psychological factors play a significant role in how we perceive sound quality. Confirmation bias powerfully shapes our listening experience. If you've invested thousands in a vinyl setup and believe analog sounds better, you're more likely to notice aspects of the sound that confirm this belief. Expectation affects perception. Simply telling listeners they're hearing an expensive system makes them rate the sound quality higher, even when it's the same equipment. Another crucial factor often overlooked in the format wars, recording quality. mastering decisions, and playback equipment frequently matter more than the format itself. A poorly recorded vinyl album played on a budget turntable through low-quality speakers will sound worse than a well-mastered digital file played through a good DAC and quality speakers. The mastering process has a profound impact on how music sounds. Many modern digital releases are mastered with excessive compression and limited dynamic range, while vinyl releases of the same album often receive a different master with greater dynamic range due to the physical limitations of the format. This creates a situation where the same album might genuinely sound better on vinyl, not because vinyl is inherently superior, but because that version received a better mastering job. This factor alone might explain many perceived differences between formats. Playback equipment introduces another layer of complexity. Turntables, cartridges, phono preamps, DACs, amplifiers, and speakers all color the sound in various ways. The warmth some associate with vinyl might partly come from the harmonic distortion introduced by the equipment used to play it. At standard CD quality, 44.1 kHz, 16-bit, most research indicates digital errors fall below the threshold of human perception in typical listening situations. Vinyl surface noise, inner groove distortion, and wow and flutter are technically much larger deviations from the original signal than digital errors, yet many listeners find these analog imperfections pleasing rather than distracting. This brings us to an important distinction: technical accuracy versus subjective preference. Digital audio can achieve greater technical accuracy in reproducing the electrical signal from the mastering console, but technical accuracy doesn't automatically translate to subjective enjoyment. Some listeners genuinely prefer the sound of analog formats with their specific colorations and imperfections. I've prepared some audio examples where you can try identifying the format for yourself. Audio examples would play here in the video. Did you correctly identify which was which? Many listeners find this exercise surprisingly difficult when they don't know in advance what they're hearing. For most people in most situations, the differences between formats are subtle or imperceptible, especially with high-quality digital. The most significant differences you're likely to hear come from factors beyond the format itself: the quality of the original recording, the mastering decisions, and the playback equipment you're using. Format preferences often reflect what listeners value most in their music experience. Those who prioritize convenience, consistency, and freedom from physical defects tend to prefer digital. Those who value physical interaction with music, the ritual of careful listening, and the specific coloration that analog introduces often prefer vinyl or tape. Neither preference is wrong. They simply reflect different priorities. The real question might not be, can you hear the difference, but rather, does the difference matter to you? If you enjoy the vinyl experience, that value exists regardless of whether you can identify the format in a blind test. But digital audio technology continues to evolve, raising an interesting question. Can digital audio overcome its fundamental compromises and deliver an experience that satisfies even the most demanding analog enthusiasts? High-resolution digital, closing the gap. What if we could take so many digital samples that the gaps between them became effectively meaningless? This is exactly the idea behind high-resolution digital audio, a set of formats designed to minimize the compromises we've discussed by capturing sound with far greater precision than standard digital formats. Imagine listening to a familiar jazz recording and suddenly noticing the subtle brush of a guitarist's fingers across strings, or the gentle breath of a saxophonist between note details that remain hidden until experienced through high-resolution audio. While CD-quality audio has served as the consumer standard for decades, high-resolution formats dramatically expand these boundaries with specifications like 24-bit 96 kHz and 24-bit 192 kHz, offering significantly enhanced detail. A 192 kHz sample rate theoretically captures frequencies up to 96 kHz, extending far beyond human hearing capabilities, which max out around 20 kHz for most people. This seemingly excessive approach serves a practical purpose. Real-world digital filters require a transition band where frequencies gradually attenuate rather than cutting off precisely at the Nyquist limit. Higher sampling rates create a comfortable buffer zone around the frequencies we actually hear, allowing engineers to design gentler filters that introduce fewer artifacts in the audible spectrum. These formats also enhance temporal resolution, the precision with which we can locate sounds in time. CD quality sampling takes measurements approximately every 23 microseconds, while 192 kHz sampling narrows this to about 5 microseconds. This improved precision may better preserve the attack of instruments like drums and plucked strings, providing a more accurate sense of when each sound begins, that initial crack of a snare or pluck of a guitar string that gives instruments their distinctive character. The jump from 16 to 24 bits addresses quantization issues by expanding from 65,536 possible amplitude values to approximately 16.7 million. This expansion lowers the noise floor from around minus 96 dB to approximately minus 144 dB, well below both human hearing thresholds and the ambient noise in even the quietest recording environments. The expanded dynamic range preserves subtle details in quiet passages with remarkable precision, allowing you to hear the full decay of a piano note or the ambient room sound around a vocalist. The mathematics suggest that properly implemented 24 bits 192 kHz recording and playback eliminates nearly all measurable technical limitations of digital audio. But can people actually hear these improvements? The research presents mixed conclusions. Some studies, including Meyer and Moran's 2007 research, found that listeners identified high-resolution audio correctly only 49.8% of the time, essentially random guessing. Critics have questioned whether the equipment or specific music selections in these tests might have obscure potential differences. More recent studies show trained listeners sometimes identifying high-resolution audio at rates better than chance, particularly with percussion, acoustic instruments with complex harmonics, and recordings featuring wide dynamic range. The practical realities of music production further complicate the picture. Many recordings undergo compression during mixing and mastering, limiting the dynamic range that high bit depths theoretically preserve. Pop and rock recordings are frequently mastered for loudness rather than subtle dynamic nuances, potentially reducing high-resolution benefits compared to classical or jazz recordings. How most people consume music adds another layer of complexity. Streaming services typically compress audio to save bandwidth, negating many high-resolution advantages. Even services marketed as high-resolution often use compression that discards information. Many listeners use equipment from basic earbuds to Bluetooth speakers that introduces limitations far more significant than the difference between CD quality and high-resolution formats. For casual listening in noisy environments like cars or public transportation, these theoretical benefits likely make little difference. However, for focused listening on quality equipment in quiet spaces, some listeners report meaningful improvements with high-resolution audio. High-resolution digital formats essentially attempt to solve digital audio problems by taking measurements with such frequency and precision that any compromises fall well outside human perception. Engineers have created a buffer zone around digital audio limitations, ensuring that if there are still differences between high-resolution digital and analog formats, they likely stem from other factors, recording processes, mastering decisions, or playback equipment. From a technical standpoint, high-resolution formats address most theoretical limitations of digital audio. From a perceptual standpoint, results vary. Some listeners hear significant improvements, while others detect no difference, suggesting benefits might depend on specific recording techniques, musical content, listening environments, and individual hearing sensitivity. What seems increasingly clear is that high-resolution digital formats have pushed technical limitations below the threshold of human perception for most listeners in most situations. If preferences for analog formats persist, they likely stem from factors beyond basic sampling and quantization issues, perhaps the different mastering approaches used for vinyl, or the pleasing distortions that analog equipment introduces. This reveals the real trade-off at the heart of the digital audio revolution. If high-resolution digital can theoretically match or exceed analog's technical performance, then the choice between formats isn't primarily about sound quality anymore. It's about how we want to experience music, the convenience and accessibility. The convenience revolution. Would you trade a small amount of sound quality for the ability to carry every song ever recorded in your pocket? This isn't a hypothetical question. It's the bargain we've all accepted, often without realizing it. The digital audio revolution represents one of the most dramatic transformations in how humans experience music since the invention of recording itself. Consider what music consumption looked like just 30 years ago. If you wanted to hear a specific song, you needed to own a physical copy, a vinyl record, cassette tape, or CD. Your music collection was limited by physical space and financial constraints. Discovering new music meant radio, recommendations from friends, or taking chances on unknown artists at record stores. Each listening experience required deliberate action, selecting an album, placing it on a turntable or into a player, and committing to at least a full side of music. Today, that world seems almost unimaginably restrictive. The average smartphone can access virtually every commercially released song in history through streaming services. Your entire music collection travels with you everywhere. New releases arrive instantly, and algorithms continuously suggest music based on your listening habits. You can skip any song within seconds if it doesn't immediately capture your interest. This transformation happened with remarkable speed. The MP3 format became widely adopted in the late 1990s. The iPod revolutionized portable music in 2001, and streaming services gained mainstream adoption in the 2010s. In just 2 decades, we shifted from physical media dominating music consumption to a world where many young listeners have never owned a physical album. Music has become ubiquitous, accessible anywhere with an internet connection. Your favorite songs accompany you through commutes, workouts, and travels. The financial model has transformed from individual album purchases to monthly subscriptions offering unlimited access. The barrier to music discovery has virtually disappeared, allowing listeners to explore genres and artists they might never have encountered in the physical media era. Digital technology has democratized music production and distribution. Musicians can create professional quality recordings on laptops without expensive studio time. Distribution platforms allow independent artists to release music globally without record label support. This has sparked an explosion of creativity and diversity, with niche genres finding dedicated audiences that would have been impossible to reach in the physical retail era. But this convenience revolution comes with trade-offs. The transition from physical to digital formats has fundamentally changed our relationship with music in ways both subtle and profound. Physical music collections represent significant investments of money, space, and identity. Owning records or CDs meant making choices about which music deserved a permanent place in your life. The albums on your shelf made a statement about who you were. Listening was often an attentive, dedicated activity, sitting in front of speakers, studying album artwork, reading liner notes, and experiencing an album as a complete artistic statement. With unlimited digital access, music has become more abundant but potentially less precious. When any song is instantly available, the commitment to each listening experience can diminish. The average streaming service user skips a track after just 14 seconds if it doesn't immediately appeal. Album-oriented listening has declined, with playlists and single tracks becoming the dominant consumption method. The physical artifacts, album artwork, liner notes, lyric sheets, have largely disappeared from the experience. This abundance raises questions about how deeply we connect with music in the streaming era. Research suggests that unlimited options can sometimes lead to less satisfaction rather than more. Listeners might spend more time searching and skipping than deeply engaging with any particular piece of music. The paradox of choice suggests that too many options can actually reduce enjoyment rather than enhance it. The streaming economic model presents challenges for artists, paying significantly less per list than physical sales. Many musicians earn fractions of a cent per stream, requiring millions of plays to generate meaningful income. This has pushed artists toward touring as their primary revenue source, a model that became particularly problematic during the pandemic. Interestingly, some listeners are seeking a middle ground. Vinyl records have experienced a remarkable resurgence, with sales growing consistently since 2007. Many music fans maintain both digital streaming subscriptions for everyday listening and vinyl collections for music they particularly value. This hybrid approach suggests different formats serve different purposes rather than one replacing the other entirely. Digital technology has enabled higher quality streaming options that attempt to bridge the gap. Services now offer lossless and high-resolution streaming that preserve more of the original recording quality. Better digital to analog converters in consumer devices help minimize technical limitations. This technological evolution means that even as we've embraced convenience, the quality gap has steadily narrowed. Is the convenience worth the subtle sound quality sacrifice? For most listeners, the trade-off has been overwhelmingly worthwhile. The ability to access virtually any recorded music instantly, anywhere, represents a kind of musical freedom unimaginable a generation ago. Music has become more accessible, diverse, and integrated into our daily lives than ever before. Understanding these trade-offs doesn't diminish either format. Recognizing digital audio's technical compromises helps us appreciate the remarkable engineering that makes this convenience possible. Similarly, understanding what might be lost in digital conversion explains the enduring appeal of analog formats for certain listening experiences. This knowledge allows us to make informed choices about how we experience music. We can choose streaming for its convenience while recognizing its limitations. We can choose vinyl for dedicated listening sessions where ritual and potential sound quality benefits matter more. We can appreciate digital audio as the brilliant technical compromise it is, sacrificing theoretical perfection in ways most listeners never notice to deliver practical benefits that have transformed how we experience music. The beautiful compromise. What if the lie of digital audio isn't a flaw, but one of the most brilliant technological compromises ever made? Throughout this exploration of how digital audio works, we frame sampling and quantization as lies, ways that digital formats deviate from the continuous reality of sound waves. But perhaps we should view these not as flaws, but as ingenious trade-offs that enabled a revolution in how humans experience music. The engineers who developed digital audio in the 1970s and 80s faced an immense challenge. They needed to find a way to represent infinitely variable sound waves. The limitations of storage, processing power, and digital systems made capturing everything impossible. So they asked a different question. What aspects of sound matter most to human perception, and what can we safely discard? This shift in perspective transformed the problem. Instead of attempting perfect reproduction, a technical impossibility, they sought perceptual equivalence. Could they create digital sound that human ears would find indistinguishable from the original, even if the waveforms looked different under analysis? The science of psychoacoustics, how humans perceive sound, became central to this effort. Researchers discovered that our hearing has specific limitations and patterns. We're more sensitive to some frequencies than others. We can't hear phase differences in certain situations. Our perception of one sound can mask our ability to hear another. These insights provided a roadmap for what could be preserved and what could be approximated. The Nyquist theorem provided the first key insight. By sampling at twice the highest frequency humans can hear, we could theoretically capture all the frequencies relevant to our perception. This means that sampling at 44.1 kHz allowed the capture of frequencies up to 22.05 kHz, comfortably above human hearing limits of around 20 kHz. When you listen to a CD, you're experiencing sound with frequencies that span the entire range of what your ears can detect. Bit depth calculations followed similar thinking. Engineers determined that 16 bits provided approximately 96 dB of dynamic range, the difference between the quietest and loudest sounds the system could reproduce. This exceeded the range between the threshold of hearing and the threshold of pain in typical listening environments. The standard aligned with human perceptual limits to deliver emotionally impactful experiences. These decisions reflected a profound understanding that perfect technical reproduction might be less important than perceptual equivalence. By focusing on what humans can actually hear, rather what test equipment can measure, engineers created systems that use available resources efficiently while still delivering satisfying results. The history of digital audio reveals a series of calculated compromises. The compact disc 44.1 kHz 16-bit standard represented a balance point between quality and practicality when established in the 1980s. MP3 compression took this compromise further, using perceptual encoding to identify and discard sounds that would likely be masked by other, more prominent sounds in the recording. This reduced file sizes dramatically while maintaining subjective quality that many listeners found acceptable. What's remarkable is how well these compromises worked. The compact disc delivered sound quality that satisfied listeners for decades. MP3s enabled the portable digital music revolution. Streaming services built on these foundations now deliver music to billions of listeners worldwide. These technologies succeeded because their creators understood a profound truth. Perfect reproduction might be the wrong goal. The purpose of recorded music is to create an emotionally meaningful experience for the listener. Choosing between analog and digital formats is like choosing between oil painting and photography. Neither is inherently superior. They're different art forms with unique characteristics. Photography can capture precise details that painting cannot, while painting conveys emotion through brushstrokes and texture that photography might miss. Similarly, digital audio captures certain elements with remarkable precision, while analog formats preserve qualities like the continuous nature of sound waves that some listeners cherish. Digital audio preserves frequency response across the audible spectrum. Noise floors can be pushed below audibility. timing precision can be maintained to microseconds. These achievements matter tremendously for some music and listening situations. Analog formats preserve other qualities, particular forms of distortion that some find pleasing, and a physical connection to the recording process. These characteristics might matter more for other musical styles or listening preferences. Both analog and digital formats deserve places in our musical lives. Understanding their differences allows us to choose the right tool for each listening situation rather than declaring one approach universally superior. I encourage you to experiment with different formats yourself. If you've never experienced vinyl, visit a friend who has a good turntable. If you've been streaming compressed audio, try a high-resolution digital option. Compare the same recording across different formats and systems. Your personal preferences matter more than technical specifications. Why is the history of recording a story of beautiful technical compromises? Because engineers found ways to preserve what matters most while discarding what humans can't perceive. They balance technical limitations against perceptual realities to create systems that deliver meaningful musical experiences. Now that you understand what's really happening in your headphones, what will you listen for? Perhaps you'll pay more attention to how different formats reproduce your favorite music. Maybe you'll experiment with various listening approaches to find what brings you the most enjoyment. Or perhaps you'll simply appreciate the remarkable technical achievements that make today's musical abundance possible. The next time you stream music, remember what's actually happening. Those perfect-sounding songs are clever approximations, thousands of snapshots stitched together to mimic continuous sound waves. This brilliant technical compromise changed how we experience music forever. Try this experiment. Play your favorite track on vinyl, then streaming. Notice the warmth of analog's continuous waveforms versus digital's precision. What subtle textures emerge? Knowing what's happening beneath the surface transforms your relationship with music. The choice between digital convenience and analog connection isn't about right or wrong. It's personal.